Welcome everybody to our next online talk in our Maxine series, Science Goes Public. We're happy to have you with us again. Today I'm representing Babette Eid again. This series is every Tuesday with scientists from our institute. They present parts of their life and work in this format. And today I proudly present Myles Menz. He's a research fellow at our institute. Hi, Myles.
Hi, Monica.
Good to have you here.
Thank you.
The first question I have for you is, why did you become a biologist?
It's a fairly good question. I've always generally been interested in animals, whether it be birds, insects, or mammals, and it just sort of became a logical choice for me, really. I've been interested ever since I was a kid, and then studied it throughout university and continued on. So I've generally been fascinated in the topic pretty much all my life, actually.
So we can see or hear that you're native English speaking. You're from Australia and you studied biology there, and then you went to Switzerland for your master's and back to Australia for the PhD. So it was like a ping pong. How do you like living in Germany now?
Exactly. Yeah, I have moved back and forth quite a few times. I really enjoy it here, actually. Good institute, nice place to live. Constance is lovely, so I'm quite enjoying the time here in Europe.
Very nice. How do you experience all the differences in the insects in your research field?
Yeah, it is really quite different. I mean, we have a very different assemblage from the southern hemisphere up here. What we do have over here, which I find particularly interesting, is a lot more of the very obvious seasonal migration, which I'll be talking about today. So yeah, it's really quite an interesting and different system to investigate.
That's very good. So we will hear more about that in the following minutes. And your talk has the title Tracking Insect Migration Through Space and Time. And you will exactly give insights in different populations of insects and how they migrate here. That's very nice. For all of you out there, feel free to ask questions in the chat on YouTube. I will ask them in the end of the talk and hand them over to Myles. And for now, Myles, I hand it over to you. Enjoy your presentation, and everyone out there also enjoy the presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Monica. And thanks to everyone for tuning in and taking an interest in the topic. It's certainly something that's fascinated me for a long time. I've always been quite interested in insect movement itself, whether it be small scale, so insects moving between flowers as pollinators, or large scale, such as migration. And the migration is what I'm going to be talking about today. And that's going to be looking at how we can track insects not only in space, so where they're moving, but how this migration might actually change across time itself. And so my key research themes tend to fall into four fairly major topics. So one would be, how does migratory insect populations change over time? So do we see strong declines or increases in certain species? Secondly, how can we actually track these in space? So can we follow migration routes? And this can be done either using observational data, citizen science data, or direct tracking, which I'll talk about later. Also, the response of migratory insects to environmental change. So how do they move with the weather? Is this on a local scale? So for example, selecting favorable winds that might help them get where they want to go while they're migrating, or how this happens across a larger temporal scale. So greening, vegetation for them to feed on, temperature and other resources. And finally, something which is surprisingly not looked at much is the impacts of migratory insects on ecosystems. And so migratory insects are actually extremely abundant, and they provide very important roles, for example, such as pollinators, or they can be detrimental pest species feeding on crops or eating other vegetation. And I'll discuss that a bit further down the road. So when we think about migratory insects, one of the main study species that people tend to really think about mainly is the monarch butterfly we have here. And this species is very well known. It migrates in the millions between North America and down into, say, Mexico. And it winters in these huge groups in certain trees, and it finds itself in just a few small sites throughout the southern United States and northern Mexico. This species is extremely iconic as a migrant. They're large, and they're a very obvious butterfly to see. Get my pointer going. Good. However, what's interesting is there are many sort of lesser known species which are just as abundant and just as spectacular, really. So, for example, here in Europe, we have the painted lady butterfly. This is Vanessa cardui, Distelfalter in German. This species moves between Europe, Northern Europe and Africa, even as far as south of the Sahara. We also have other species such as hoverflies, Schwebfliegen in German. These species are extremely important pollinators, many of them, and a lot of the larvae also feed on aphids, Blattläuse, which are quite major crop pests. So these are actually a very beneficial species. And even down in the very small end of things, we have the aphids themselves, the Blattläuse here. And these are fairly weak flyers in comparison, but it's actually even been shown that these species can select favorable winds to blow them in the direction that they want to go during migration. So they can move up and down through the air column. So they can also actually really undergo directed migration. So insect migration in itself is extremely widespread among insects, and it covers a broad range of strategies and a large number of species. One of the examples that I like to point out, and I find really quite fascinating myself, is this example here of the Pantala flavescens it's a Wanderlibelle. It's the wandering glider in English. And this is a large dragonfly that's actually thought to migrate from southern India out across the Indian Ocean, stopping over past the Maldives and the Seychelles, and actually into Eastern Africa. And then it heads back up through the north, out the top of Somalia and back into northern India. And this is probably one of the longest migratory routes, actually, as far as we know, with insects. And it's quite extraordinary because they're crossing an ocean, which is not particularly common. And what else is interesting here is that these are apparently providing a very important food source for Amur falcons. There's a small picture in the bottom of the plot there. And these Amur falcons actually follow a similar migratory route. So this species of dragonfly is probably also providing a very important food source to the falcons as they're undergoing their migration. Now, tracking insect migration in itself is actually fairly difficult compared to birds, larger species of mammals, other things. We can't really fit a lot of standard tracking devices on them now. So in comparison to a lot of other larger vertebrate species, insect migration itself is actually fairly poorly known, apart from a few really key examples that I've given, such as the monarch butterfly, and also, for example, locusts in Africa. In general, it's fairly challenging to study, partly because insects themselves are small. So, as I mentioned before, we can't really fit a lot of larger tracking devices to them. And they're also extremely abundant. So when we might talk about millions in birds undergoing a migration through Europe into Africa, we're talking billions to trillions of insects. So not only they're small, they're extremely abundant, so it makes tracking individuals very difficult. And one of the other main key issues between insect migrants and vertebrates is they actually have a typically multi-generational migration. So for example, in birds, you might have an individual that flies from, say, Germany down into Africa to breed, and then it turns around, down in Africa to winter, and then it turns around and flies back up to Germany to breed the following year, and so on. In the case of insects, we might have a generation in Europe. One flies down into southern Europe for the winter, and then they might stepwise move north. So there might be a generation that just moves a few hundred kilometers and breeds again, and then the offspring travel. A very good example of this is the painted lady butterfly that I mentioned before, Vanessa Cardui. And this species, it's actually been shown that there's at least 6 generations that travel from Scandinavia down into Africa on the migration. And now it's thought that there's probably even up to 8 to 10 that migrate even further down into Africa and turn around and come back. So again, this is a very complex system. You have many individuals involved, and so it's quite hard to follow the whole thing en route. This gives us a bit of challenge, but it also makes it quite an interesting phenomenon. And so how this migratory tendency is actually passed on through the offspring, and also what might cause individuals to choose whether they fly north or south, depending on the season. So I'm going to move a bit now into my main study systems that I work on. So here they are the hoverflies. So in this case, particularly the marmalade hoverfly, Epicerphus balteatus, the Hainschwebfliege, and the death's head hawk moth, the Totenkopfschwärmer. These are both really quite fascinating systems in their own right, and also cover quite strongly the scale of migrants. And so the hoverflies that we study may be 1 to 1.5 centimeters, weighing only 100 milligrams or so, versus the death's head hawk moth, which has a wingspan of probably 12 centimeters above and can weigh up to 2.5 or 3 grams. So they're quite a massive animal. So initially, I'll start discussing some hoverfly migration, because I think this is a very interesting migratory system, and it's actually not particularly well understood or well known globally, but hoverflies, in fact, are actually really quite important parts of the ecosystem. So here's just a brief overview of a few species of hoverfly, which are generally quite common, but also describe much of the general form. So on the top row here, from A to D, we have the aphid-feeding hoverflies. So the larvae of all of these species feed on Blattläuse, and they're really quite important predators of Blattläuse, which are often significant crop pests. It's been known as well that, so for example, the one in panel A, Epicerphus balteatus, a larva of one larva can feed probably up to 400 aphids during its life cycle and development. So you can actually imagine that a population of these can eat quite a significant volume of these little crop pests. The species on the bottom, so from E through to H, their larvae actually are semi-aquatic, so they'll feed on rotting plant material and microorganisms. They're often found in tree hollows, ponds, and other little wet areas. And all of these species are actually really important pollinators as adults. Hoverflies have been recognized as just important as bees, and if not more in some plant species. And so they're really quite useful and important for us to understand their movements and their migratory dynamics. What we see across Europe is that actually hoverfly migration in itself has been reported from quite a number of sites. And the majority of individuals or reports we see are actually of 2 main species, which is A and E here. The marmalade hoverfly I mentioned before, and E is the drone fly, Eristalis tenax. It's known as the Mistbiene in German, because the larvae are often found in piles of cow manure in farming landscapes, and they're quite important as part of the decomposition there in the landscape. What we see here is most of these reports, shown by the blue arrows in the map, are actually heading southwards. These migrations actually tend to concentrate along areas such as coastlines, which you can see here, and down on the sides here in the Baltic coast, or they tend to get funneled through pinch points in mountain passes, such as along the Alps or also along the Pyrenees. And hoverfly migration in Europe has actually been recognized quite strongly since the 1940s. So Lack and colleagues studied in the Pyrenees, and also then Aber and other colleagues from Switzerland began studying them in the Swiss Alps in about the 1960s. But since then, there hasn't been a lot done, and there's now a bit more awareness actually starting to rise on this front. So as I mentioned before, insects, as they migrate, they tend to be quite small, they're very abundant, and they can often actually fly very high up in the air. So they might fly either from ground level or potentially up to a kilometre or more above the ground. So how do we actually observe this and actually track this as they're moving? And one method that we're beginning to use a lot, that's actually taken off in the past few decades, is actually using radar to quantify them. So as a remote observational tool. And so what we have here is, this is a picture of the unit of the radar. We actually have one of these sitting here in Constance. The data I'm going to show for the next few slides is from the United Kingdom with some colleagues from England. And so what we have here is, this is an entomological radar. So it's actually been tuned to work for detecting insects. But what it really is it's actually originally a marine radar system. So basically it's a very similar system to what is often on ships and quite commonly used. But the difference here is, instead of having a cross T antenna, which is often seen on ships, they've replaced it with a small dish, and the dish just faces up. It's only about 1 degree wide, so that it actually provides quite high resolution. So it becomes a short, sort of narrow pencil beam, and it can detect insects probably up to about 1,200 meters above the ground, so 1.2 kilometers. And for this, they need to be fairly large insects, but it can see quite small things, even only maybe tens of milligrams, a few hundred meters above ground. So this actually gives us a very high resolution observational tool. It sits there, it monitors day and night, so it's very consistent, and it can record multiple different insect signals at once. So this is a very, very useful tool. One of the drawbacks of this is, from the reflections we get back from the radar signals, we can tell, for example, what the size and the shape of the insect might be, how heavy it might be, and the direction it's moving in. Beyond that, you actually need to require some supporting data to actually work out exactly what you're looking at. So in some cases, it's quite clear for certain shaped insects, but in others, for example, such as the hoverflies, we might want to actually use an additional data source to actually try and understand what we're observing in the radar beam. And so in this case, when we investigated hoverflies, we actually wanted to couple our radar observations with citizen science data. So this is in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of quite good citizen science programs over there, and in this case, we were using the Hoverfly Recording Scheme. And this is a national scheme where people go out and send in observations of the different hoverflies that they see. And in this case, the majority of the insects that we detected in the radar based on size and shape are thought to be these two hoverflies here. This is the Heinschwebflieger that I've been talking about. And then there's another very common migratory species, Oepiornis corollae. And what we actually see is that if we look at the grey, which is the grey line is the recording scheme, and the blue is what we detect from the radar across each month, is that we actually see a very strong agreement in the data. So the more of these targets that we observe with the radar that we identify as hoverflies, during these times we're actually seeing far more records and reports of hoverflies themselves. So this actually gives us a level of confidence that what we're looking at are actually the hoverflies that we're interested in. So the radar can give us an idea of the abundance, what we might be seeing, how many animals there are and where they are in the air, so in 3 dimensions. But also what it can do is tell us a direction. So it's very useful in the sense that we can not only get the direction in which the animal is facing, so a head and a tail, but also the track, so which it's traveling. And what we can see is that into southern England in the spring, we see a northwards movement, so northwest, and this is the influx of the flies coming in from the continent. During summer, we actually don't really see any particular directional behaviour, and this is to be expected. So this is a generation where they're breeding, they're feeding, they're building up the populations, and then in autumn, they turn around and they head back down towards the south. What we also see is that compared to the immigration in spring and the emigration in autumn, we actually have a much larger number of dots, and these are the dots, the blue dots around the circles are the directions of the insects, so groups of insects flying. And this is actually what we might expect, because for these insects, migrating is very beneficial. They're moving into Europe, they're breeding, they're boosting the population, and then they turn around and fly back south. Now, in terms of quantifying this from the radar, we can actually get a rough number or an abundance of this. And what we estimate is that on average, across the 10 years of these radar observations, is that there were about 408 million hoverflies immigrating into the UK each year. And in terms of the increase that we see in autumn, this translated to about 1.5 billion on average of these animals leaving the United Kingdom. And so this is an incredibly large, not only number, but also mass of animals. And so it equates to about 32 tons of general biomass, estimated from generally scaling up from the number of insects we see. And this itself probably translates, to put it in context, to the weight of about 800 cows. But also in terms of coverage, this means probably about 20 hoverflies per square metre of cereal crops, so Gerade in the UK. So this is actually providing a very useful service for both pollination and also pest control in crops. And what was really quite interesting is that across this 10 years of observation, is that while we saw changes, so we see peaks and decreases generally in the number of insects that we report each year. So if we look at the black line, this is the full year. But we don't actually see a large decline across this 1 decade of tracking. So insect declines themselves have really been very widely reported across Europe and actually globally now. And in many cases, we see very sharp declines. In this case, we don't actually see a decline based on this data. But what we think might be happening is that the decline has potentially already happened. So this is only from 2000 on. So much of the agricultural intensification in Europe, so clearing of hedges, increasing farmland, more pesticides, happened from the 50s and the 60s. And so we expect that post the 1960s was probably a major decline. And then after that, we may be seeing what's sort of a new lower population density of these animals. So what we really need to see here is actually more long-term studies. And so this is fairly recent, but in the longer term, we may see quite different patterns. As I mentioned before, from the radar itself, we can actually also see how the insects are behaving. And what we can see here is that in spring, the insects themselves aren't following a particularly directed flight in terms of, do they select particular winds in which to fly? And we tended to record them flying under more general conditions. And in spring, the actual prevailing winds coming up from the south tend to actually be blowing northwards. So they're actually quite favourable. So the flies themselves have more opportunity to move north. Northward migration in hoverflies isn't particularly well known, partly because it seems to be quite dispersed. So it's more across the landscape, and it's not necessarily funneled through points like alpine passes. So it might be a more gradual process. What we see here is in autumn that the flies themselves, they're actually migrating under conditions that aren't necessarily favourable. So most winds aren't blowing southwards in the autumn. And so in this case, from our radar data, we see that they're actually selecting favourable winds, which will help blow them further south. So this also provides a bit more evidence that actually migration in hoverflies is really quite active. It's a decision to do it. For many years, insect migration was thought to be a bit more of a passive process. So they were just blowing with the winds. But now we know actually we have much more data that that's really not the case. And even very small animals such as hoverflies and even aphids can actually select the right conditions for where they want to go. You can see this similarly here in terms of the directionality of the flight. In that autumn, they're actually choosing their directions much more strongly in comparison to when they would fly in the spring. So as I mentioned before, what we actually need to do to understand this migratory dynamics beyond what we've seen from the radar is actually longer term studies. And so this takes me to some work I started in Switzerland about 6 years ago. And this is investigating hoverfly migration again, but this time it's at a pass called Col de Breteuil in southern Switzerland. And here we have the Alpine Pass, and you can see there's a small station here with these two huts, and this is operated by the Swiss Ornithological Institute, the Schweizerische Vogelwarte. And what we have here is on the lower half of the screen is Switzerland, and on the upper half in the shadow is actually France. So it's a very southerly site in Switzerland, but also it's a site surrounded by quite high mountains. So the pass itself sits at about 1,900 meters, whereas the surrounding mountains might get up to 3,500. So this is actually a very important funneling site for migrating animals as they move south in the autumn. And it's been well known for bird research, which they've been doing since the very early 1960s. But interestingly enough as well, this is a very, very important site for insect migration, and much of these alpine passes are. The difference here is we have the benefit that in 1962, Jacques Aber, who was from the University of Lausanne, actually began studying insect migration over a period of about 12 years. And he studied a very broad range of species, but primarily actually he focused a lot on hoverflies, which is really quite fascinating and great for us because we have a really nice historical data set. And so here in this middle picture here, all these little black dots, which are sitting in the bag at the end of this net, these are all hoverflies. These are Mistbiene, the Eristalis tenax, which was actually one of the most abundant flies at the time. What's also really great is that from that time, so over that period of 12 years, we actually have all the original data, which we're still actually getting through. And that was all on these punch hole cards, these Lochkarten. But this actually gave us hourly observations. So throughout autumn, Aber was up there each year for 12 years, studying at the pass from end of June, early July, until about the end of October. So for those 3 months in autumn, we have very, very detailed observations. This card here in particular is from the 8th of July, 1972 at 8 a.m. So we have very good data. We have all the wind and the weather. And since 2015, we've actually been repeating this work. So we have the high detail work, and we've actually rebuilt the same capture mechanism that he used from the original designs. You can see here, and we're using the same system with this bag on the end to try and monitor hoverfly migration across a longer time scale. So what we have is 12 years historically, and then we're now starting to have a number of years in the more modern times. And so what we can see here is that our main hoverflies, the blue line here is Episurfus balteatus, the Heimschwebflieger, which is here in panel A. And then in the orange line here, we have Eristalis tenax, the Mistbiene. These are our two most common species. And across the 12 years from 1962, which was our highest year. So in 1962, Aber actually recorded 250,000 of these animals in just 3 months. And this actually would translate to the, if we think about the size of the Alpine Pass. So these traps themselves are 2 meters high and 4 meters wide. And if we think that these flies actually migrate across the whole pass, which is over 1 kilometer, and actually up quite high in the air, we can estimate that there's probably up to 65 million hoverflies passing through just maybe a single one of these alpine passes. So again, this is a massive phenomenon. But unfortunately, what we've seen compared to the historical data in our modern data is there's actually been really quite a massive decrease in the number of flies that we capture. So this has been really quite a shocking decline. So up to probably 90% or more fewer flies. So for us, if we record maybe a few thousand, that's really quite good versus tens of thousands to up to the hundreds of thousands that they would have recorded 40 and 50 years ago. So this is really a massive drop, and this is actually in agreement with some of the other insect decline numbers that have been seen across Europe. So if we think of the Krefeld experiment, which was very, very popular, they were observing about 80% decline. And actually very recently, there was a paper published from Randecker, a site in the Schwäbische Alb. And this is by Wolfgatter. And Wolfgatter has actually also been studying hoverfly migration from a similar time period. And he recorded very similar results. So what we are seeing is actually not just an isolated case, but this is a general pattern of massive decline in migratory hoverflies, which is really quite concerning because, as I mentioned, these species are very important pollinators, and they're also very important predators of certain species that feed on agricultural crops. So this is something that we really need to take into consideration in future in terms of management. What we think might be happening is this is probably to do with agricultural intensification, as I mentioned earlier. So while some of these species still look fairly common in the landscape, particularly the one in panel A here, the numbers are only a fraction of what they used to be, and part of this is probably due to a lot of pesticide. The one here in panel E, the mistbiene, part of its decline, we think it might also be due to modern farming practices. So the larvae of this species actually feed inside Misthäufen, so manure piles in agricultural landscapes. And a lot of these have actually been replaced with modern standard fertilizer. Similarly as well, a lot of these species will breed in hollow trees, so wet hollows on the tree that actually capture rain and some leaf litter. And again, a lot of these trees have been lost because of clearing of hedgerows and old orchards, so established landscape structures. So this is actually quite the stark contrast to what we saw in the radar data, which was a current, no real current decline in that 10 years. However, as I mentioned before, we think that again, as we see here, the decline itself has really already happened. So while these animals are extremely abundant now, they would have been much more abundant in the past. And again, these animals themselves, so this is actually just autumn migration. So from this little plot, we can see that here, the majority of our animals are caught heading southwest versus northeast. So this is just what's happening in the autumn. And we don't actually know what's going on in terms of the spring increase or decrease over that time. From the radar data, we saw that the population still looked fairly stable. But again, we don't have that historical perspective yet. So that's an area that really would be very interesting to investigate. And similarly as well, actually here at the pass, we had a radar positioned here as well. So we were trapping at the same time that we were using the radar to observe insects. And what we can see down here in these yellow bars, this is the daytime movement. And we actually see that much of the movement is concentrated about 75 to 175 meters above the ground, which actually coincides directly with where we had our traps. So our traps were situated at a pass and the radar was sitting below the pass, observing upwards. So what we can see, not only are we recording these declines, but we're also actually recording within the appropriate airspace that the animals are flying. So they're not just flying over the top or around or something like that. So this is actually quite a real picture of what's going on. This is something that we're still going. We did field work this year and we hope to provide a bit more further information in the coming 6 to 12 months. So now I'm going to move from the hoverfly system across to this one, which is the death's head hawk moth, the Totenkopfschwärmer. And this is a species that I've started working on fairly recently. The species is an uncommon migrant in Europe. People do encounter them, but quite rarely. They are here, but they're really not very abundant. The species actually, breeds and lives year-round in Africa, so south of the Sahara. And part of the population actually migrates up from Africa into Europe in summer. And then they have another breeding generation about July, August, and then the adults that emerge turn around and fly back. So we probably get only one generation in Europe. But these are really quite a fascinating species because they're a very long distance migrant. And they're probably actually going from Europe into Africa south of the Sahara with just a single individual, which is really quite a long flight for these. The larvae themselves, the caterpillars, these are, which you can see in the bottom corner of the screen. These feed on potatoes, so you can actually find them in potato fields. Also in southern parts of Germany and central Germany. We find them regularly in Switzerland. They leave quite a distinctive feeding remains, and so they very neatly eat all the leaves and just leave a little stick. And you can see this one's just sitting on it there. And these are really quite large and obvious caterpillars. The adults themselves feed on honey. So they actually go inside honeybee hives and feed on honey directly from the honeycomb. And so they have a very short proboscis, the rissel, which they use to pierce the wax top of the comb, and they suck the honey directly out. Part of the reason they don't get attacked by bees is they actually smell like the beehive. So they have a chemical in their cuticle, in their skin, that actually smells like the beehive, so they don't get attacked. Beekeepers sometimes do find them if they get stuck, but otherwise they actually just go in, steal a bit of honey, and then go back out. These are not really very common, so they're probably not going to be doing any damage or harm to the bees, and they don't really want to stay in the hive for very long anyway. So what we did here is we used individual tracking to actually try and track their migration en route. And so here in this picture that I showed before, we can actually see that this individual is fitted with a very small radio transmitter. So this is similar to the standard radio transmitters that people use for tracking birds and other mammals. It's very small. This one only weighs 240 milligrams, whereas this moth itself is probably 2.5 grams. So the tag itself is only about 10% of the animal's body weight. And they're very, very strong flyers, and so they can actually travel with the tags really quite well. And so this is a project I've been working on here with Martin for the past year or two. And what we see is we first take our moths. Before we tag them, we have to actually feed them. So as I mentioned before, they feed honey. So we feed them on a 50-50 honey solution here. And you can see just in front of the eye there, this very short, very strong proboscis that they actually use to pierce the honeycomb when they're in beehives. So what we wanted to know here is, can we actually track these animals on migration, and how do they behave? And so to do this, we fitted them with these very small radio transmitters, and we actually followed them with a small aeroplane, and Martin does all the flying. And so we released them at night near Constance and basically followed them as they flew. And what we see is actually, yes, we really can track these animals and track them quite well. So out of 26 which we tagged over the 2 years, 14 of these actually did a long distance movement. So these are animals that left Constance and were found the following day down near Zurich or over that way. And for 7 of these, we actually have really quite complete migratory tracks. And so if you can see on the panel with the coloured tracks, there's a few pink and blue tracks heading directly south, and these animals we were actually able to follow in a single night, and they travelled up to 80 kilometres in one night, often flying 25, even up to 40 kilometres an hour in terms of ground speed. So they fly very fast, and what's really quite interesting is they fly very straight. And so this gives an indication that they have a very preferred direction in which they want to fly. And in this case, it tends to be either south or southwest, which is really in line with what we would expect from an autumn migration of these animals heading back to Africa. With the dotted lines, the blue one in particular, heading south there in Switzerland, we were able to actually detect the animal 1 or 2 days after we tracked it at night, and it had crossed the Alps and was down in Ticino near Locarno in Switzerland, so nearly in Italy in just 2 days, which is really quite amazing for a 2-gram animal. So this is an ongoing project, and I hope to be able to tell you more about this in future. Just before I finished, I thought I would like to give you a bit of an overview of another fairly large ongoing project we have that I find quite of interest as well, because we're actually using citizen science here to track butterfly migration. And in this project, we used the red admiral butterfly, Admiral Vanessa Atalanta. This species is really quite obvious. It's fairly easy to identify, and it makes it really quite ideal for a citizen science project because they're quite a distinct butterfly. You can really see them flying around, and because of that, we actually hoped that we'd get a lot of observations of these as they're moving on migration. So we actually asked people to report the butterflies when they saw them, and a little bit of information on what they were doing. And we've been doing this since 2016, and this is the PhD project of Marco Thoma, one of my PhD students in Switzerland. And to do this, we actually partnered up with over 40 citizen science organizations. For example, NABU in Germany, Naturgucker and others, the European Bird Portal, etc. And these all agreed to share the butterfly data with us. And this gave us a coverage of over 20 European countries from just countrywide portals, plus some other ones that we set up. And in the end, this was actually quite a successful project. It was very challenging because we're dealing with many different languages, we're dealing with many countries, many organizations. Organizations had different data that they recorded. So this was quite an exercise in management, but also communication. And in the end, I think it turned out really well. And broad coverage, so far we see that we have over 1 million records of this species across Europe. But this is just for 2 of the major years. And we get really, really good coverage. And so we see that they're all the way up into Scandinavia, down towards the Canary Islands. And this species is also really quite good to do a project like this with, because it migrates only really within Europe. And so even from these records, you see we have very few down here in northern Morocco, a little bit over here, southern Greece, but really most of the migration actually takes place between the Mediterranean and up into northern Europe. Only in very, very large years of lots of butterflies do they tend to get into northern Africa. So we've got very good coverage, and the next step is to now model the dynamics of these insects and actually see how greening and weather, temperature, rainfall actually influences their movements and colonization of the continent. So this is something that people can be involved in and report their records. We have a Twitter page here if anyone's interested to follow on. We often report some of our migration results, plus also generally a lot of other projects that people are doing that involve citizen science work. So it's really a good way to get involved in this sort of research. So with that, I'll finish up. Just some acknowledgements to all the people that I've worked with over the past few years, both from here and in Switzerland. And And if you'd like any further information, you can follow Twitter. We have a website here, insectmigration.com. And otherwise, I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
I'm coming back. Hi again. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Now we all might a lot more about insects, at least I do. I do have some questions, but I would like to start with one because I'm not an expert in insects, and I really want to know if you know how long they usually live. How is it in different populations? I mean, painted lady butterflies, hoverflies, Totenkopfschwärmer. Do you know if they live for a couple of years, or how is it with their predators?
Usually, with many insects, as an adult, the lifespan is maybe only a few weeks to a few months. Yeah, so they're quite short-lived. In a lot of these migrants, the adults will maybe fly south and lay eggs, and then they die, and then the offspring will then emerge and continue on. In some species, such as the monarch butterfly, that actually go in winter in Mexico or in southern United States, these will actually live longer, so quite a few months, because in those cases, it's the same individual that goes back part of the way. But in many cases, it's just quite short-lived, just a few weeks, maybe to a few months.
But basically, their life is all about flying and reproduction.
Mostly, yes, yeah. In a lot of the very long-lived insects, it's the larvae that are very long-lived.
Yeah. Okay. Then I have the first question from YouTube. Do you know what gives the depart information for these insects? For example, the hoverflies. Is it the climate? Is it winter, spring, or something else causing the departure?
Yeah, good question. We don't exactly know. In many of these cases, it seems it's probably a temperature change, and also mixed with day length. So as the days start to become shorter into autumn, or longer as you're heading into spring and early summer, mixed with a temperature change. So some dragonflies that Martin studied in North America, they actually saw that one of the triggers was a number of cold nights before the migration. So a few cold nights that dropped, and then that switched them into migration mode. So it's probably a combination between a number of factors. But yeah, mostly I'd say temperature and day length.
So the climate change will have a huge influence in the future? Yeah,
certainly. Certainly in a number of species, not only climate, but also landscape change. So a lot of the time they're also moving, for example, from Europe because there's no food left. So, the plants that they feed on die off. For example, in North America, some monarch populations in Florida have actually stopped migrating, and they spend year round because people have been planting the food plant that grows all year round. So it's warm, they have food, and so a number of them have actually stopped moving. Yeah.
Okay. And would it also change the winds with they normally use the winds to travel. If the climate influences the winds, it will also be harder to travel.
Maybe, but in the case that we see certainly with some of our insects is that at certain times of the year they will just migrate.
Okay.
So they will use favorable winds if they can. So a southerly wind in autumn. But if they can't, sometimes they just fly very, very low to the ground or around mountains and actually just fly directly into the headwind. And we see this with birds too. Okay. So if they really need to go, they try and reduce the energy cost and fly very, very low and push through. But they will prefer to use favorable winds if they can.
Of course. Well, heading on to the next question. What would be your suggestion? What can we as humans contribute at the moment to save the different insect populations?
Good. One of the main things I think is one of the major problems we tend to have is generally loss of habitat. And this may be as simple as not many flowering plants around. So a lot of our migrants, even moths and things, will feed on nectar and pollen. So if we think about a lot of farm landscapes now, it's just a field of grains or something like this. And so even providing these Buntbrache, these wildflower strips, can actually provide important resources. People can plant local flowers, so having available some native flowers. And again, it's better to use native plants, but actually having things even in your own garden, leaving habitat. So flowering plants, for bees, they like old wood, sticks to nest in. Older trees are very good for a lot of these things that nest in the hollows, and all of basically trying to maintain structure. When it's too clean, we tend to remove a lot of what they need.
Yeah, so back to nature would be a good suggestion. Yeah, very nice. Do you think it's realistic to use GPS tags like Icarus tags on insects in the near future?
Well, that's a good question. I'd love to. We're very limited in weight, so the insects are still a bit too small. It's something I think people are really hoping to do, and that's part of the process, is to try and miniaturize tags even further. But at the moment, most of our insects are really quite small for GPS tracking technology, sadly. So we have to do it the old-fashioned way, but it works. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe in the future it works with the Icarus tags.
Hoping in future, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
As technology is developing, as these systems are used more, there's more drive to actually miniaturize them, also for birds and bats and things as well. So the smaller it is, the broader range of species you can work on. So yeah, that's certainly on the horizon. Exactly when, I'm not sure. Hopefully not too long.
Hopefully we will feel or see it. Then we have a thank you, great talk. With another question, do you think you rather see a decrease in migrants or a decrease in migration?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's probably a mix, but mostly a decline in migrants. So, in migrants themselves, in the general number of animals. As I mentioned with the monarchs, some species will reduce their migration and start to remain over winter. But again, it really depends. So for things that live in Europe, staying in winter can be quite risky because it gets very cold. So if they can find a refuge, then maybe. We do see in some hoverflies that they will actually spend the winter. Normally migrating hoverflies will spend the winter in cities and places like this where it's a bit warmer and there's flowers around. But the proportion of the population is very low. So not yet. It's not yet at a stage where a large number are stopping to migrate. Some are probably changing, but it's not a lot. So most of it is just the general population decline. But that is certainly something that changes with climate, with season, and with food resources. Yeah.
One question to your what you showed before, that the hoverflies and the mistbiene, I don't know the English word of this, that there was a huge decline after 10 years, like in 1962 to 1972, there were a lot of them, and then they just were basically gone. Is it real, or could it also be a problem of research methods?
I would say it's real. So the gap we had in the data, there's that time gap where in Switzerland, at least, no one was looking at it until we started. And similarly in Germany, they started again. The pattern is general. So from what we see in the Alps, it looks very similar to what we see in the Schwäbische Alb at Rande Kamar here in Germany. The the proportion of decline is very, very similar. It also fits as well with broad patterns. So the 75–80% decline that people have been reporting in Germany in the nature parks from this Krefeld study. So I would say it's a real pattern, and the evidence is adding up. Of course, we need to, when we talk insect declines, we do need to be a bit cautious because not everything will respond the same way. And, some species can do fine in certain environments, whereas in at least what we're studying with these hoverflies, they have showed a massive decline. And I think, I would say that's quite real. The evidence is really stacking up now. But it's a real pattern. Yeah.
Good to know. Great. There was one comment on the nature. That does mean keep dead trees and grow plants like the Nachtkerze, which is a flower with a lot of yellow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's part of I would say one of the main reasons of what we're seeing these insect declines is habitat loss and removal. We want good flower availability, native flowers, and places for things to nest in. And also refuges. So even a hedge in a farmland is a refuge for things to survive the winter. So maintaining structure and things, natural things in the landscape is really key.
That were some very nice words for the end. I think we're coming to an end. It's almost 8 and there are no more questions right now. If there will be more questions, we will hand them over to you.
Sure.
So we are always open for questions per email. Thank you very much, Myles, also for this nice question and answer in the end now. And for you all out there, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram, and maybe, just stick around and come to the next talks. Next week, there is Wolfgang Fiedler in German with us again. He's telling us something, and I will say it in German, ausgetrillert auf den Spuren der letzten brütenden Brachvögel in Baden-Württemberg. Very exciting talk again. And for now, I want to say thank you for being here, and I wish you a very nice evening. Goodbye.